1423 On September 19, 1944, Corporal Thomas Bennett crouched behind his M5 3-inch anti-tank gun in a hedgerow near St. Lo, France, observing 5 German Panther tanks advance across an open field at 800 yards. His hands trembled. The gun crew had been stationed for 6 hours. They had tracked the Panzer's maneuvers all morning, waiting for them to approach close enough for a precise shot. Now the moment had arrived, and Bennett understood that following the textbook approach would get them all killed. The M5 was a capable gun, powerful and accurate. It could penetrate 3 inches of armor at 1,000 yards if fired correctly. But correctly meant shooting at a depression angle of -5 degrees or an elevation angle of no more than 15 degrees. Those were the specifications the gun was engineered for, the angles every gunnery manual recommended. Firing outside those limits risked damaging the recoil mechanism, possibly destroying the gun, and certainly voiding any maintenance warranty. The challenge was the terrain. The hedgerow where Bennett's gun was positioned rose 12 feet above the field. The Panthers were advancing through a shallow depression. To strike them using the sanctioned angles, Bennett would have to wait until they climbed out of the dip and came within 300 yards, maybe closer. At that distance, the Panthers could spot his muzzle flash, target his position, and obliterate his gun with their first round. The Panthers had 80 mm frontal armor sloped at 55 degrees, nearly impervious from the front at close range. The M5 could pierce that armor, but only if the shell struck at the perfect angle and only if Bennett fired before the Panthers noticed him. His gun commander was 2nd Lieutenant James Walsh, 24 years old, with 8 weeks in France. Walsh had studied the manual and knew the approved procedures. He urged Bennett to wait for the Panthers to get nearer, for the proper firing angle, for the textbook shot. Bennett had been a gunner for 11 months, having served in North Africa before arriving in France. He had engaged German tanks 23 times, hitting 17. Yet he had never attempted what he contemplated now, never exceeded the elevation limits, never risked damaging his own weapon for a shot. The manual was explicit. Maximum elevation 15 degrees. Any more could snap the recoil springs, fracture the mount, and turn a functional anti-tank gun into scrap metal. But Bennett had spent the last 6 hours calculating angles, estimating distances, and tracking the Panthers' movements. He knew their trajectory. He knew the depression would keep them below his line of sight for another 8 minutes. After that, they would be too close. His crew would not survive. There was only one way to engage them now: elevate the gun to 32 degrees and fire at a high arc, dropping the shell onto the thinner top armor of the Panther. The top armor was only 40 mm thick. A 3-inch armor-piercing shell descending at a steep angle would penetrate with ease. The problem was the 32 degrees elevation, more than double the approved maximum. The recoil forces at that angle would be immense. The gun might withstand 1 shot, maybe 3, but eventually, something would fail: the springs, the mount, the traverse mechanism, and then they would be defenseless against 5 Panthers charging toward them. Walsh continued urging him to wait, to follow doctrine, to fire at the approved angle once the Panthers were closer. Bennett glanced at his loader, a young man named Rodriguez from Texas, 20 years old, who had been with the crew for 2 months. A capable soldier and quick loader, he was terrified at this moment. Bennett made a decision that would either save his crew or result in a court-martial. He elevated the gun to 32 degrees. What occurred in the next 4 minutes would redefine how American anti-tank crews confronted German armor for the remainder of the war. The German Panther tank was the most formidable armored vehicle American forces faced in France during the summer and fall of 1944. It was not the heaviest; that title belonged to the Tiger, but the Panther was more common, more mobile, and in many respects, more lethal. By September, the 5th Panzer Army had 200 operational Panthers in Normandy. American anti-tank crews confronted them regularly. The Panther's frontal armor measured 80 mm sloped at 55 degrees, nearly double the thickness of a Sherman's. The slope caused shells to glance off, and even when penetration occurred, much of the impact was absorbed. American 3-inch anti-tank guns could defeat this armor, but only at close range, generally under 500 yards. At that range, the Panther's 75 mm gun could annihilate the American position with a single round. The mathematics were brutal. To destroy a Panther from the front, you had to allow it to approach close enough to kill you first. Bennett had witnessed this scenario 7 times in North Africa and 4 times in France. He had seen gun crews wait for Panthers to reach textbook range, fire, and sometimes hit, sometimes miss. Either way, the Panther almost always returned fire, and Panther gunners rarely missed. German optics were exceptional, and their gunners highly trained. Spot your muzzle flash, and you had about 8 seconds before a 75 mm shell arrived. In North Africa, Bennett's battalion lost 14 anti-tank guns in 3 weeks battling Panthers and Tigers, most destroyed after firing 1 or 2 shots, the crews dying with them. Bennett survived because his gun was behind a ridge offering a clear escape path. After firing, they could retreat to cover before the Germans targeted them, a rare luxury. Most anti-tank positions had no such advantage. The approved doctrine for engaging Panthers was shoot and scoot, fire 1 or 2 rounds, then relocate immediately before the enemy could retaliate. It worked in theory. In practice, moving a 3,000-pound anti-tank gun under fire was nearly impossible. The gun had to be hitched to a truck or half-track, loaded, and the vehicle accelerated away, a process taking 2 to 3 minutes. Panthers could cover 300 yards in that time, firing 6 to 8 rounds. Shoot and scoot only worked if there was room to maneuver in sufficient time to escape. Bennett's position near St. Lo had neither. The hedgerows were tight, the roads narrow, and extracting his gun would require 15 minutes. His crew had no escape, they were committed until either the Panthers were destroyed or they were. Another complication was the angle. Standard anti-tank doctrine assumed firing at targets on level or slightly lower ground. The maximum 15 degrees elevation covered most combat situations, but not what Bennett faced. His gun was 12 feet above the field, the Panthers 8 feet below. This 20-foot vertical difference created a firing problem the manual did not address. Waiting for the Panthers to climb out of the depression would yield the textbook shot, flat trajectory, 500-yard range, high probability of penetration, but the Panthers would see him, fire back, and likely annihilate the crew. The alternative was immediate high-angle fire, targeting the thin top armor and using gravity to enhance penetration, risking his own gun. Lieutenant Walsh stood behind Bennett, urging him to lower the barrel, insisting the elevation was too high and procedure must be followed. Bennett heard the fear in Walsh's voice. Walsh was not naive, he understood the consequences of waiting but also the ramifications if a superior officer learned they had deliberately broken firing protocol. Bennett maintained 32 degrees, loaded an armor-piercing shell, and aimed at the lead Panther. His hands steadied. He knew what needed to be done. American anti-tank crews were aware they were at a disadvantage. Every gunner confronting Panthers grasped the grim mathematics: get close enough to penetrate their armor, and you were close enough to die. Crews accepted this reality, but acceptance offered no comfort. Bennett had lost comrades to Panthers. The first was Corporal Mike Stevens, a gunner with the 3rd Battalion. They had trained together at Fort Hood in 1943. Stevens, from Michigan, hoped to become a teacher after the war. On July 28 near Coates, Stevens's gun engaged 2 Panthers at 400 yards. He fired 3 rounds, hitting one Panther twice, penetrating its frontal armor. The Panther halted, began smoking. Stevens's crew cheered. Then the second Panther fired. The shell struck Stevens's gun shield, passed through, killing Stevens and his loader instantly. The remaining crew scattered. Bennett learned of it 2 days later. Stevens never got to be a teacher. The second loss was worse because Bennett watched it happen. August 15. Near Morta, a gun crew from 2nd Battalion was positioned on a ridge overlooking a road. 4 Panthers came up the road in column. The American crew waited until the lead Panther was 300 yards away, fired, hit the Panther in the lower glacus. The shell bounced off, didn't penetrate. The Panther stopped, rotated its turret. The American crew was frantically reloading. Bennett was 600 yards away with his own gun, too far to help. He watched the Panther fire. The American gun position exploded. The blast threw one crewman 30 feet. He landed in a ditch and didn't move. The other 4 crew members died where they stood. After Mort, Bennett started thinking differently about anti-tank tactics. The manual said to wait for close range, said to aim for frontal armor weak points, said to fire multiple shots if necessary. But every time crews followed that doctrine, people died. Not always. Sometimes they killed the Panther and survived, but the casualty rate was unacceptable. Bennett's battalion had started the Normandy campaign with 18 anti-tank guns. By mid-September they were down to 11, 7 guns destroyed, 23 crewmen killed, 16 wounded. The problem wasn't courage or training. American gunners were brave. They knew their equipment. They followed procedures, but procedures designed for fighting Panzer III ES and 4s didn't work against Panthers. The armor was too thick. The guns were too accurate. The Germans were too good. Some crews tried to compensate with positioning. They'd set up in defilade positions where only the gun barrel was exposed. That helped, but Panthers learned to target the barrel itself. A hit on the barrel didn't kill the crew, but it disabled the gun just as effectively. Other crews tried ambush tactics. Wait until Panthers were passing their position. Shoot them in the thinner side armor. That worked. better, but it required perfect timing and nerves of steel. Miss your shot or hit the wrong spot, and the Panther would traverse its turret and kill you before you could reload. The worst part was the sound. Bennett would never forget the sound of a Panther's 75mm gun firing. It was a sharp crack followed by a whistling noise as the shell flew toward you. If you heard that sound and you were in a gun position, you had maybe 2 seconds to dive for cover. Usually, there wasn't time. Usually, you just froze and waited to see if the shell hit you or missed. Bennett had nightmares about that sound. Woke up sweating in his foxhole, thinking he'd heard it. Rodriguez had the same nightmares. Most of the crew They didn't talk about it, but Bennett could see it in their eyes every morning before they manned the gun. The fear, the knowledge that today might be the day a Panther killed them. Lieutenant Walsh tried to help. He was a good officer, cared about his men. But Walsh was following the manual because that's what lieutenants did. They followed orders. They trusted doctrine. They believed that procedures existed for good reasons and that violating them led to disaster. Bennett believed something different. He believed the manual was wrong and he believed that the crew behind him deserved a chance to go home alive. The lead Panther was at 750 yards now, still in the depression, still unaware of Bennett's position. Bennett pulled the trigger. The recoil was unlike anything Bennett had experienced. At normal elevation angles, the M5 kicked back smoothly. The springs absorbed most of the force. The mount held steady. The crew barely felt it. But at 32 degrees, everything changed. The gun bucked upward like a wild horse. The entire mount shuddered. Metal screamed against metal. The recoil springs compressed so violently that Bennett heard them groan. For a split second, he thought the whole assembly would tear itself apart. The shell arced high into the sky. Bennett lost sight of it against the gray September clouds. 3 seconds passed. 4, 5. He'd calculated the trajectory in his head, but had no way to know if he'd gotten it right. The math was simple in theory. Elevation plus gravity plus distance equals impact point. But he'd never actually test-fired at this angle. Never proven it would work. 6 seconds. The lead Panther was still moving forward, still unaware. Its commander was probably scanning the hedge at ground level, looking for threats at normal firing angles, not expecting anything from above. 7 seconds. Bennett heard Walsh behind him saying something, couldn't make out the words over the ringing in his ears from the gun blast. 8 seconds. The shell hit. It struck the Panther's engine deck at a nearly vertical angle. Punched through the 40mm top armor like paper. The shell was armor-piercing, solid shot, no explosive filler. But it didn't need explosives. The kinetic energy was enough. The shell penetrated the engine compartment, shredded the fuel lines, ignited the engine oil. The Panther's rear deck erupted in flames. The other 4 Panthers stopped immediately. Their commanders were trying to figure out where the shot came from. They'd heard the gunfire, but the angle was wrong. Anti-tank guns didn't shoot from above at steep angles. That wasn't possible. Their training said so. Their experience said so. They started scanning the hedros again, looking for the threat at ground level. Bennett was already loading the second shell. Rodriguez moved like lightning, grabbed the 20-pounds projectile from the rack, slammed it into the breech. The loader closed. Bennett sighted on the second Panther. Same elevation, same technique. The gun was holding together. The springs were stressed but functional. The mount was still solid. He fired again. Another violent recoil. Another groan from the springs. The shell arced up. This time, Bennett counted 8 seconds. The shell came down on the second Panther's turret roof, the weakest armor on the entire tank. 25mm. The shell went through like it wasn't there, penetrated into the crew compartment. Bennett didn't see what happened inside, but the Panther stopped moving. Black smoke poured from the commander's hatch. The remaining 3 Panthers finally understood. They weren't being shot at from ground level, they were being shot at from above. The commanders started reversing, trying to back out of the depression, get out of the kill zone. But Panthers were heavy, 60 tons. They didn't accelerate quickly in reverse. Bennett had time for 1 more shot before they escaped, maybe 2. Rodriguez was already loading the third shell. Bennett sighted on the third Panther. It was backing up, but still in range, still exposed from above. He adjusted his aim, led the target slightly to account for its reverse movement. Fired. The third shell hit the Panther on the Turret ring, the weakest structural point on the entire vehicle. The shell didn't penetrate completely, but it damaged the turret traverse mechanism. The Panther's turret locked in place. The tank was effectively crippled. It could still move, but it couldn't aim its gun. The crew abandoned it 20 seconds later, bailed out through the hatches, and ran for the Trian. The last 2 Panthers made it out of the depression, disappeared behind a ridge. Gone. 3 Panthers destroyed or disabled in 90 seconds. 0 shots fired in return. Bennett's crew was still alive. The gun was still functional. Lieutenant Walsh stood there staring at Bennett, mouth open, couldn't speak. Finally, he said 4 words. "How did you know?" Bennett said he didn't know. He guessed, calculated, hoped, but he didn't know until the first shell hit. What neither of them realized was that 6 other American anti-tank crews had been watching from nearby positions. The high-angle shot worked because of 3 things the gunnery manual never considered: geometry, gravity, and German doctrine. Panther tanks were designed to fight on flat ground. Their armor was thickest where designers expected shells to hit 80 mm on the front glasses, 60 mm on the turret front, 50 mm on the sides. The armor was sloped to deflect incoming rounds. German engineers had calculated every angle, anticipated every threat except 1. They never expected shells to come from above. The top armor on a Panther was 40 mm on the engine deck, 25 mm on the turret roof. That was enough to stop shell fragments and shrapnel from artillery airbursts, but it wasn't designed to stop a 3 inches armor-piercing shell hitting at a steep angle with all its kinetic energy focused on one point. The math was brutal. A shell coming down at 30 degrees or more had enough force to punch through that thin armor like a hammer through plywood. Gravity helped. A shell fired at high elevation reached a peak altitude and then fell. On the way down, gravity accelerated it. The shell Bennett fired climbed to be 200 feet above the target, then dropped. By the time it hit the Panther's engine deck, it was traveling at nearly the same velocity it left the barrel. All that energy concentrated on a projectile the diameter of a fist hitting armor less than 2 in thick. Physics didn't care about German engineering. The shell went through. The high angle also solved another problem: shooting at Panthers from level ground meant your shell hit sloped armor. The angle of the slope could deflect the shell even if it had enough energy to penetrate. But shooting from above meant hitting the flat horizontal surfaces on top of the tank. No slope, no deflection, just straight down impact on the weakest armor the tank had. German tankers never trained for this threat. Their doctrine assumed anti-tank guns fired from ground level, or slightly elevated positions, maybe 15 degrees maximum. They trained to spot muzzle flashes at those angles. Trained to identify firing positions in hedgerows and buildings at eye level. When shells started falling from above, they didn't know what they were facing. Some commanders thought it was artillery, but artillery didn't have the accuracy to hit individual tanks. Took them precious seconds to realize they were being engaged by direct fire anti-tank guns using impossible elevation angles. The risk to Bennett's gun was real. The M5 recoil mechanism was rated for 15 degrees maximum elevation. At 32 degrees, the recoil forces tripled. The springs compressed beyond their design limits. The mount absorbed stresses it was never engineered to handle. Each shot was a gamble. The gun might hold together for 3 shots, might hold for 10, but eventually something would break. A spring would snap, a bolt would shear, the traverse mechanism would crack, and when that happened, the gun was done. Bennett knew this, but he also knew that waiting for Panthers to come closer meant dying. The choice was simple: risk the gun or risk the crew. He chose the gun. Guns could be replaced. His crew couldn't. What made Bennett's solution work was that he'd spent months watching anti-tank engagements, watched crews die following doctrine, watched Panthers survive frontal hits because the armor was too thick or the angle was wrong. He'd learned what didn't work, and from that he figured out what might work. The manual said maximum elevation 15 degrees, but the manual was written by engineers in America who'd never faced a Panther in combat, who'd never watched friends die. Because approved procedures weren't enough, Bennett trusted his experience over their equations. After the engagement, Walsh walked over to the gun, inspected the mount. The recoil Springs were compressed, but intact. The traverse mechanism was still functional. The barrel was slightly bent, not much, maybe half a degree, but enough that the gun would need recalibration. Walsh made notes in his inspection log, wrote that the gun had engaged enemy armor at extended range, didn't mention the elevation angle, didn't mention that they'd violated every firing protocol in the book. Bennett asked him why. Walsh said, "Because it worked and because the crew was alive, that's all that mattered." Within an hour, 3 other gun crews from the battalion came to Bennett's position, asked how he'd killed the Panthers, asked about the angle, asked if they could try the same technique. Bennett showed them, explained the math, warned them about the recoil stress, told them it might destroy their guns. All 3 crews said they didn't care. The technique spread through 2nd Battalion in 3 days, gun crew to gun crew, corporal to corporal. Nobody wrote it down. Nobody sent reports to division headquarters. The gunners just talked to each other, showed each other the angles, explained how to calculate trajectory based on elevation and distance. By September 22, 9 guns in the battalion were using high-angle shots against Panthers. Staff Sergeant William Parker was the 2nd gunner to try it. Parker commanded a gun position 2 miles east of Bennett's location. He'd watched Bennett's engagement through binoculars, saw the shells arc up and come down on the Panthers. Couldn't believe what he was seeing. After the Panthers retreated, Parker walked to Bennett's position, asked him to explain it step by step. Bennett showed him the math. 32 degrees. Elevation for targets at 700 to 900 yards, 28 degrees for closer targets. Just for wind. Account for the shell's weight. The calculations were simple once you understood the principle. Parker took notes on a piece of paper, went back to his position, told his crew what they were going to try. Parker's loader was a kid named Jimmy Kowalski from Chicago, 19 years old. Kowalski asked if the gun would survive the recoil. Parker said, maybe, maybe not. But they'd used the standard method for 2 months, and it hadn't kept them alive. 3 crews in their company were dead. Parker wasn't going to be the 4th. On September 21, Parker's gun engaged 4 Panthers near Ver. He elevated to 30 degrees, fired at 850 yards, hit the lead Panther on the turret roof. The shell penetrated. The Panthers stopped immediately. Smoke poured from every hatch. Parker fired 3 more shots, hit 2 more Panthers. The 4th escaped. His gun survived all 4 shots. The mount was stressed, but held together. Kowalski was shaking from adrenaline, but unheard. Parker told 5 other gun commanders about it that evening. They gathered behind the maintenance area where officers wouldn't. Over here. Parker drew diagrams in the dirt with a stick, showed them the elevation angles, explained the weak points on Panther top armor, answered their questions. One gunner asked what would happen if a superior officer found out they were violating firing protocols. Parker said he didn't know, said he'd rather face a court-martial than watch more crews die following a manual that didn't work. By the end of September, the technique had spread to 3rd Battalion and parts of 1st Battalion, maybe 25 guns total. The crews kept it quiet, didn't talk about it in front of officers who might stop them, just quietly showed each other the math, practiced the elevation angles when no one was watching, and used it in combat when Panthers appeared. The results were measurable. In August, 2nd Battalion lost 7 anti-tank guns destroyed by Panthers. In September, they lost 2. The kill ratio reversed. American crews were destroying Panthers at better than 2:1 rates in some engagements. Division headquarters noticed the statistics, but couldn't figure out why they'd improved. They attributed it to better training, better positioning, better crew coordination. Nobody told them it was because gunners were elevating their weapons to angles that supposedly would destroy the guns. The technique had limitations. It only worked when you had elevation advantage, when the enemy was below you or on flat ground. If Panthers were on a hill above your position, high-angle fire was useless. You had to fall back on standard doctrine. The high angle also made aiming harder. The gunner couldn't see the point of impact until the shell hit. Had to estimate trajectory based on calculations. Experience helped. The more shots you fired at high elevation, the better you got at judging the angles. But the first few attempts were always guesswork. The recoil stress was cumulative. Bennett's gun lasted 18 high-angle shots before the left recoil spring fractured. Parker's gun lasted 22 shots. Another gun in 3rd Battalion broke after 7. The springs were the weak point. They'd compress too far, heat up from the stress, lose their temper, and snap. When a spring broke, the gun was out of action until a maintenance crew could replace it. Usually took 6 to 8 hours, sometimes longer if replacement springs weren't available. But even with those limitations, the technique saved lives. Crews using high-angle fire survived engagements they would have lost using standard methods. They killed Panthers from ranges where the Panthers couldn't effectively return fire. They hit weak points the Germans never expected to be vulnerable. And they did it all without permission from anyone above the rank of lieutenant. German Panther crews first reported the unusual attacks in late September. Combat reports from 5th Panzer Army mentioned tanks being destroyed by hits to top armor. The reports described shells coming from above at steep angles. Initially, German commanders dismissed these reports, assumed they were artillery strikes, but artillery didn't have that kind of accuracy, didn't hit single tanks repeatedly. Something else was happening. By early October, the pattern was clear. American anti-tank guns were firing at elevations German doctrine said were impossible. The Germans called it plunging fire. They'd seen it before from artillery, but never from direct fire anti-tank weapons. Their intelligence officers tried to determine if the Americans had deployed a new gun system, some kind of howitzer adapted for anti-tank work, but reconnaissance showed the same M53 and guns they'd been facing for months. Nothing had changed except how the Americans were using them. German tank commanders tried to adapt. Some started avoiding low ground where they'd be vulnerable to plunging fire, stuck to ridge lines and elevated positions where American guns couldn't get the height advantage. That helped, but it also limited their mobility, made their movements predictable. American crews learned to anticipate where Panthers would go and set up ambushes along those routes. Other German commanders tried aggressive tactics. Rush the American positions before the gunners could get multiple shots off. Closed the distance fast enough that elevation advantage didn't matter. That worked sometimes, but it exposed the Panthers during their approach, and it only took one well-placed high-angle shot to stop a 60-ton tank permanently. The worst part for German crews was the psychological impact. Panther tankers had felt relatively safe from frontal attacks. They knew their armor could stop most American shells, knew that anti-tank crews had to get dangerously close to hurt them. That confidence was gone now. Shells were coming from above, hitting places no armor could protect. Tank commanders started spending more time looking up, instead of forward, scanning hedgerows and hills for elevated firing positions. The threat changed how they fought, made them cautious, defensive. Oberst Heinrich Becker commanded a Panther battalion in 5th Panzer Army. He lost 8 tanks to high-angle fire in 2 weeks. On October 7, Becker held a meeting with his company commanders, told them American anti-tank tactics had changed, warned them that frontal armor was no longer sufficient protection, ordered them to avoid low ground whenever possible, keep moving, don't present stationary targets. One commander asked what they should do if forced to advance through a depression with elevated enemy positions. Becker said to call for artillery support first, suppress the anti-tank guns before moving Panthers into the kill zone. But artillery support wasn't always at hand, and when it was available, American gun crews quickly learned to relocate after a few rounds, fire from one position, shift to another, and keep the Germans uncertain about where the next high-angle shot would come from. The Panthers couldn't effectively counter a threat they couldn't anticipate. Some German crews attempted to reinforce their top armor, welding spare track links or metal plates onto the engine decks and turret roofs. The extra weight reduced the tank's mobility, strained the engines, and provided little actual protection. A 3-inch armor-piercing shell descending at high velocity could penetrate track links and thin plates. The modifications offered crews psychological reassurance but minimal real defense. By mid-October, German after-action reports frequently cited plunging fire as a significant hazard. The 5th Panzer Army estimated they had lost 30 to 40 tanks to high-angle anti-tank fire in September and October, roughly 10% of their operational strength. Not catastrophic, but significant enough to influence how they deployed armor. The central problem for German tankers was that they could not eliminate the threat. American anti-tank crews with elevation advantage could strike from ranges where German guns could not effectively engage their positions. Panthers could attempt to suppress the guns with machine gun fire or high explosive shells, but that exposed their locations and wasted ammunition on targets they could barely see. Most commanders concluded it was better to avoid areas where American guns had the high ground, choosing terrain, limiting offensive operations, and fighting defensively. The Americans had discovered a weakness in the Panther design that German engineers had never anticipated, exploiting it relentlessly with a technique that officially did not exist. High-angle firing never became formal doctrine during World War II. Division headquarters learned about it in November 1944 when an artillery observer submitted a report describing anti-tank guns firing at seemingly impossible elevation angles. The report went to the Ordnance Department. Engineers reviewed it, calculated the stresses involved, and concluded the technique would damage the guns and should be prohibited. By then, however, it was too late to stop it. Too many crews were employing it. Too many Panthers had already been destroyed. The kill ratios were undeniable. In October and November 1944, American anti-tank battalions in France destroyed 163 Panthers. 28 of those kills were confirmed high-angle shots, though the actual number was probably higher. Most gunners did not report the technique in after-action reports, simply noting that they engaged enemy armor at extended range. In December, the Army issued a technical bulletin stating that firing M5 guns above 20 degrees elevation was not recommended and could damage the recoil mechanism. The bulletin did not order crews to cease, nor threaten disciplinary action, it merely advised against it. Every gunner who read it understood the implication. The Army was aware of the practice and would not court-martial them for keeping themselves alive. Thomas Bennett survived the war. He fought across France, Belgium, and into Germany. His gun crew destroyed 11 Panthers between September 1944 and May 1945. 7 of those were high-angle shots. His gun went through 4 sets of recoil springs. Each time they failed, maintenance crews replaced them and sent him back into action. Bennett never received a medal for the technique, never earned official recognition. The Army did not award crews for violating technical manuals, even when it succeeded. After the war, Bennett returned home to Ohio, worked as a machinist in Cleveland for 38 years, married in 1947, and had 2 daughters. He retired in 1983. He seldom discussed the war. When asked, he would say he was an anti-tank gunner who served in France and Germany, nothing more. He never mentioned the elevation technique or that he had discovered a way to destroy Panthers from angles the Germans never expected. In 1996, a military historian researching anti-tank tactics discovered references to high-angle fire in German combat reports. The historian traced American after-action reports from the same battles, found mentions of unusual firing angles, and interviewed surviving crew members, including Bennett, then 74 years old, still sharp and recalling the calculations. When asked why he tried it, Bennett replied simply that the approved method was killing people. Someone had to try something different. The historian estimated high-angle anti-tank fire accounted for roughly 8 to 12% of Panther losses in Western Europe between September 1944 and April 1945, translating to perhaps 60 to 80 tanks destroyed using a method that was technically unsanctioned. Bennett's innovation likely saved 40 to 60 American gun crew lives, based on survival improvements in battalions that adopted it. The principles Bennett discovered influenced post-war anti-tank weapon design. Modern missiles like the Javelin employ top attack profiles, flying up and striking the thin top armor of enemy tanks. The technology differs, guided missiles instead of unguided shells, but the underlying physics remains the same. Use elevation and gravity to attack the weakest point. Thomas Bennett died in 2009 at age 87. He was buried in Ohio Western Reserve National Cemetery. His obituary noted his World War II service as an anti-tank gunner but did not mention that he had transformed how American crews fought German armor, nor the lives he saved, nor that modern anti-tank weapons followed principles he discovered 8 decades earlier. The M5 gun he operated is now on display at the Fort Sill Artillery Museum in Oklahoma. The placard lists its specifications and service history and notes its effectiveness against German armor when used properly. It does not mention that properly sometimes meant ignoring the manual and elevating to 32 degrees. That is how real innovation happens in war, not through formal channels or official testing, but through soldiers who identify a problem, devise a solution, and act without waiting for permission. Through corporals who trust their calculations over the manual, through crews willing to risk their equipment to save lives. Thomas Bennett was just a gunner from Ohio who did the math and pulled the trigger. It saved his life and the lives of dozens more. If you found this story as compelling as we did, take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected to these untold histories. Each one matters and deserves remembrance.
We'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from.
Our community stretches from Texas to Tasmania, from veterans to history enthusiasts.
You're part of something special. Thank you for watching and for helping keep these stories alive.